Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass. Johan Oberg is off in Sweden on vacation this week, so I'm going to be doing this show solo, but I'm excited to have with me Toby Ferenczi.
Ferenczi, yeah. It's not an easy
one. Again, I'm going to do that, Ferenczi. I'm going to do that again because it's not good, okay?
Okay.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass. Johan is off on vacation somewhere in Sweden this week, but we're excited to have with us Toby Ferenczi. Toby, welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
I am super excited to have you on the show. You work for a company called Granular Energy, but I think it makes sense, as I always say at the beginning of my shows, for you to introduce yourself personally and professionally so our audience knows who we're talking to today.
Great, sure. Well, thanks. As you mentioned, I work for a company called Granular Energy. I'm actually the co-founder and CEO. So Granular Energy is a startup company. We're still fairly new. We've been going for about nearly 2 years now. We are 22 people spread across Europe and North America. And we provide software for energy utilities. And this software enables them to track and manage the flow of renewable energy from generation sources to their customers by helping them to manage renewable energy certificates. And we're going to dive into what are renewable energy certificates shortly on the podcast. But by doing this, we're actually hoping to change fundamentally how consumers buy energy of any kind. Just my background. So I've spent quite a long time in the renewables industry. I started out, I studied physics. I did a PhD in solar energy. I worked for General Electric for a few years, and then this is now my third energy startup. Going back like 7 years ago, I was doing a demand response startup, which was optimizing electric vehicles and batteries. That company was sold to a big UK utility called OVO Energy. And it was during my time there, I started to think a lot about how renewable energy is certified. How do consumers choose one type of energy over another? And that led me to set up a nonprofit called Energy Tag, which is a nonprofit standards body for time-stamped energy certificates. So we'll come to what those are at some point, I'm sure. And whilst running this nonprofit called Energy Tag, which has now been handed over, led me and my co-founders to come up with Granular Energy, which is solving one of the key pain points when it comes to utilities giving more transparency to their customers over where their energy is coming from. And we'll talk about like exactly why that's so important.
Well, awesome. Well, welcome to the show. In your introduction, you implied that consumers have some say or even care where their energy comes from. Let's start there because I don't know.
Yeah.
I call the power company, they turn on my power, and I pay a bill. So help me.
Totally. I mean, it is an interesting concept, right? Like, how do you choose where your energy has come from, right? Because all the power stations, all the generation assets are connected to the same electric grid. So you can't physically tell whether the power flowing into your home or your business has come from a solar plant or a coal power station. So we'll talk about the mechanism for how consumers make that choice today and how that's evolving. But to your question, which I think is a really interesting one, which is why? Why choose? Why do you care? For me, I think it is an incredibly important consumer choice to enable. I actually think it's probably the most important consumer choice that any of us have, is to choose where your energy comes from, right? If you choose any kind of make a decision as a consumer, this is the one you should care about. And that's because we need to accelerate the rate at which we go through the energy transition, right? From a fossil fuel based system to a clean energy based system. We also need to electrify everything, right? We need to shift all vehicles to electric. We need to electrify heating and cooling and industry. And so making this choice and doing so in a way that helps the deployment of new technologies that take us on that transition is a way to enable everyone, right? All organizations, all individuals to actually have an impact. And what's really interesting, if you look at the kind of population of consumers, whether they're individuals or businesses, sure, not everyone cares, but a surprising number of people do. Um, where I'm from in the UK, a really significant portion of individuals buy green energy from a green energy supplier, which we'll talk about what that actually means. And then more and more businesses are starting to choose to buy renewable energy as a way of reducing their carbon emissions, right? Their carbon emissions shows up in what's called Scope 2 carbon accounting. And one of the most effective ways to reduce your carbon footprint is to buy renewable energy. And so this is just becoming increasingly important as a mechanism. But if there's no trust, right? If you don't know that by buying renewable energy, you're making a credible consumer choice and you're actually having a difference, it's making at the end of the day, it's having an impact, then there's no point, right? There has to be the mechanism to choose one type of energy over another has to be reliable and robust, and that's exactly the issue that we are addressing.
Now, is this a function of economics? So I'm looking at green energy because it's cheaper because it's a windy day or a sunny day, or is it a function just of save the planet because we don't want global warming and we want to try to not have things warm up as quickly? What's the
Yeah,
driver here for most
I think
people?
I think it can and it should be a mixture of both, right? Like there are renewable energy today is a very cheap form of energy generation, the cheapest form of energy generation of any kind. So we shouldn't be paying a premium to access renewable energy, certainly not at certain times of day. There are other times of day, right, when renewable energy might be in scarcity, when it might cost a little bit of a premium, and that's where we think that that's where we're really getting at is like how can choosing clean energy really send a price signal to incentivize all of those other technologies that we're going to need if we want to get the grid to become zero carbon. But you need to have that consumers leading the discussion because governments are moving too slowly. Right? If you look globally, we're not on track right now to hit the 1.5 degree climate targets. Consumers are way out in front. Not all consumers, but the consumers that care about sustainability are way out in front of governments on this topic. And it's harnessing that consumer demand, that leading edge consumer demand to send the right price signals that's going to drive cost reduction and deployment of these technologies at scale. That's one of the key tools that we have in order to get there faster.
So, as a bit of a pessimist myself, what I've seen is a bit of Wild West. So, I'm into the energy transition. I spend time on this podcast. We talk to folks all the time, and so what I think is you'll see your energy company give you a green offering. Say, hey, you know what? Slight premium. We want to give you a green offering. So you guys can feel good and sleep well at night. Here's your green offering. Um, but I think you alluded to this in your introduction as well. We don't really know where those electrons are coming from because it goes into the grid and we don't understand that. So how does the
Yeah.
average consumer or enterprise for that matter make sure that what they're paying for is what they're getting?
Yeah, totally. Well, there I think we need to back up a little bit and talk about the basis for all renewable energy contracts, all of those green offers. What is it about what they're offering you that allows them to claim that it's green? And so that is actually a system which is a global system, generally referred to as the generic term for them are called energy attribute certificates. In the US, they're commonly known as RECs, renewable energy certificates. In Europe, it's actually part of a European legislation, a system called guarantees of origin. In the UK, where I'm based, they're called REGOs, but they're all essentially the same type of instrument, these energy attribute certificates. And the way these instruments work, they were developed over 20 years ago and exist in all developed energy markets around the world. And the way they work is each generator, as it produces a unit of energy and exports it to the grid, they get a certificate. And that certificate is kept on a centralized registry. And these registries are normally, they're called, or tracking systems as they're sometimes called. They're generally operated by either a grid operator or a government authority, like a regulator. And so all of these certificates are kept by a central authority, and then consumers or utilities on behalf of their consumers can buy these certificates and claim them against their consumption. So you can say that for that megawatt hour, because I have the certificate, my energy has come from that source. And because there's a centralized registry run by an authority here, you can be absolutely sure that there's no double counting. No one else has laid claim to the same instrument. So whilst it's not, and no one is pretending that it's physically a physical representation of like electrons in the grid, it is a very reliable accounting system, and it's served pretty well for the last 20 years. And the demand for these certificates globally has been going up and up because they're the only basis for these green offers that you see from the utilities, and they're the only basis for kind of making purchases of renewable energy to reduce your scope 2 carbon emissions, which is kind of really important for businesses who want to like assess who are now required in many places to actually report on their carbon emissions. What's really interesting about this system, though, is that whilst it's a reliable accounting system, it hasn't changed in the last 20 years, and it hasn't moved with the times. And the main issue that kind of I noticed, like going back 5 years ago, and led to this nonprofit, is the fact that the certificates are based today on an annual matching process and don't record the time of when the energy was produced. They tell you where the energy's come from, but they're missing a timestamp telling you when that unit of energy was generated. And so that means that essentially, if you use 10 megawatt hours, 10 units of energy in a year, and you buy 10 certificates, as long as those certificates were produced in the same 12-month window as when you consume the energy, you're actually allowed to claim to be 100% renewable energy and have zero carbon emissions, right? And the problem with that is that really does not reflect any kind of reality on grids today. You can kind of see how it didn't really matter when these systems were set up over 20 years ago because there were no renewables on the grid. So grid balancing didn't really matter. But annual matching, in effect, what that means is I could buy all of my certificates from a solar farm, right, in June, in the summer, and claim to be using that energy at any point in the year, including at nighttime in the winter, right? And we all know like the sun doesn't shine at night. So it doesn't really make sense. It's causing a lot of concern around accusations of greenwashing, and it's also not sending an effective price signal to the market, right? Because all of the like certificates are valued the same regardless of time of day, so regardless of supply and demand. And put it simply, right? Renewable energy. This is the point we were talking about earlier. Renewable energy should be cheap when it's an oversupply and more expensive when it's in undersupply. And that's not the case with the current certificate system. So the big idea is to take these certificate systems, which are well established, they're in every market in the world. It's a $12 billion industry today. It's set to be $100 billion by 2030. So this isn't small change that's spent on these certificates. But to take that same certificate system, add the missing timestamp to those certificates, and then you can use them to say where your energies come from in a specific 1 hour or half hour period. And that has lots of benefits, which I'd love to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So So I think you covered, and even in our pre-call, I think I mentioned that we had Meredith Angwin on the show, a while back, and she talked about a lot of the things that folks did with Rex in North America and how they didn't really do what they were designed to do or what people hoped they would do. So you came along, started this nonprofit. You added timestamps. You got a lot of folks to sign up and agree to go do this. So it's pretty well received that this is the problem. So now that I have timestamps and I could say, okay, so this one was actually produced in September and it was during daylight hours, so it was probably solar and it probably is green. What do I do with that certificate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, the idea of these time-stamped energy certificates. So first of all, um, the way you use them is you say, yeah, my energy is coming from this source in this particular hour of day. And that just makes, if you want to make a claim that you're consuming energy, whether that's because you've got um, customers that care about sustainability or something you care about, it's a much more reliable and trustworthy claim because, like this, that there was wind being produced at that corresponding time. You're linking production to consumption in real time, and that link didn't exist before. And this is important, by the way, like just in terms of trust to the market. The Irish Advertising Standards Agency recently, a few weeks back, they banned suppliers from selling these 100% renewable offers based on the old annual matching system. So the system needs to change just from a trust, a greenwashing perspective. But what we're really excited about is the fact that um, these are tradable instruments, right? So if you have these tradable instruments, you start to see price formation, right? So the certificates, when there's lots of renewable energy are available, are cheaper, and they become more expensive in the hours when there's less renewables around. And there's a whole mechanism by which battery storage and flexibility can benefit, because if you're a battery, you can import. When you import electricity from the grid, you can buy renewable energy by buying these certificates and export it. You can reissue new certificates and capture the spread between the low price hours and the high price hours. So there's a mechanism for flexibility and battery storage to actually benefit from the price spread of these things. And so what that means is, when you're as a consumer and you make this choice and you say, I want to be renewable powered, and I want to be renewable powered in as many hours as possible, you're actually starting to send a real price signal to the market that's helping not only build more renewable energy, but actually all of these other technologies that we're going to need as well, like energy storage and flexibility. And there's lots of ways that these can be further incentivized, right? Like you can use them to incentivize local consumption of green energy, so that you're reducing stresses on the grid, taking pressure off the transmission system. So there's lots of different problems that you can solve once these certificates are available. But the primary demand right now is coming from big corporates, like companies like Google and Microsoft, who have enormous electricity demand for their data centers, and they really are at pains to show the environmental impact of this massive increase in electricity consumption is minimized. And so they're really invested in there being a solid mechanism to buy renewable energy. So they actually have been big supporters of energy tag, and proponents of this concept of what's called 24/7 clean energy. And now many corporates and even organizations like the US federal government have set what are called 24/7 clean energy targets, where they're trying to get to a certain level of renewable energy on an hourly basis.
So help me understand this, and this is just simple ignorance here of how this works. So the grid's got a base load. So let's say we have some coal plants and some nuclear plants and some other turbine generating some power somewhere, because it's dark, it's wintertime, it's 6 p.m. and it's dark and it's cold and we need energy. And so there's only so much battery capacity out there today, right? So I get that I could play the spread. If I had a grid scale battery, I could play the spreads there. How does this really get somebody to 24 hours of clean energy because the base load is still being produced with hydrocarbons?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, no, that's literally the whole point. It's hard to be 24/7 clean energy today, right? Like it's
Right, but how is this changing the market? So what are the economics or what are the driver that I'm not quite catching here? So I get that there's certificates that I can say that, hey, I bought clean
yeah,
energy and I paid a premium to have this proof that I bought so much
yeah,
clean energy, the premium, or maybe not a premium, maybe it's
yeah.
discount, whatever. But how does that change when there's more demand than supply? So then it goes back to maybe a hydrocarbon or another source. So how does that turn that into 24 hours of clean energy? I'm confused.
So what the goals of these companies are to eventually get to 24/7 clean energy. But Google and Microsoft, they're not there today. Their goal is to get there by 2030. So right now, what they need is a mechanism to see which hours they're renewable powered and which hours they're not. And so that's why they can't use the old recs, because the old traditional recs don't carry this temporal information. They need these new recs to see where they are. And then once you take a baseline, and it's not just Google and Microsoft now, there's more and more companies interested in this kind of baselining, saying which hours have I got renewable energy from my purchases, which hours have I got gaps. That's your first step, right? And you
Okay,
are
so
going to
you
be
get a baseline and
relying.
you say, okay, there's these 7 hours a day that I still need renewables
Exactly.
and I can't prove them there. So
Yeah.
what's the next
So,
step?
so then you have a choice, right? There's several ways you can start to gradually fill those gaps. One is, and this might be the cheapest, is to do some demand response, to do some load shifting, right? Shift your consumption from times when there's generally less renewables on the grid to times when there's more available, right? And this is a whole new revenue stream or value stream for demand response that hasn't existed. The second thing, as you mentioned, might be to um, if you've got access to a battery or your utility has a battery, they can use that battery to shift load from one time to another. And then the other thing is to go source more renewable energy, from typically generation sources that are better suited to your shape, to your mismatching, right? If most of your renewable energy is previously coming from solar, then go find some wind resources, go find some hydro, to help fill these gaps, and that then creates a premium for those technologies that are able to deliver clean energy when it's actually needed. And that's what we really need, right? It's not just about adding more and more renewables, adding more solar in a place that already has too much solar. Um, we need to create new incentives for these other technologies that deliver clean energy when and where it's most needed. Does that make sense? There's a really good. I'm happy to share it in the links, but there's a really good study from Princeton, um, Jesse Jenkins's group, where they did modeling of the price volatility of these time-stamped energy certificates, and then looking at what the potential impact of that could be in terms of investment decisions and so forth. So we'll share a link to that, but looking at like how this actually translates into real world benefits.
And then with these certificates with timestamps, you already mentioned that somebody could basically arbitrage or use battery to do the different pricing. So you envision a marketplace for these certificates then?
Yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, once you've done your baselining, and that's actually the software that we provide some software to utilities that helps them essentially do baselines of 24/7 for all of their customers by managing portfolios of their helping with the portfolio management of renewable energy certificates, both the traditional RECs and these new timestamp RECs. The next thing is, okay, how do I go source from the market? Um, and there, it's really interesting to think how these new certificates will be traded. What's interesting is like how the way the certificates are traded today, where timing doesn't even come into it. They're traded by a lot of the same people that trade carbon offsets, and it's a fairly opaque market. It doesn't work like the power market at all. We think when you add a timestamp to the certificates, and the timestamp matches the delivery period in the power market, so normally 1 hour or half an hour, down to 5 minutes in some places. The way we trade these certificates starts to look a bit more like how we trade power today. And the way we trade power is through a range of different venues and different types of contracts, depending on what we're looking to do. So a lot of power is traded well ahead of time under forward contracts, right? This is stuff you know, Chris. And then as you get closer to the delivery period, you want to shape your to match your profile, and then you need to and then you rely as you get closer to that delivery period on centralized spot markets like the day ahead auctions or the intraday markets. And so we actually think you're going to start to see the emergence of similar types of trading venues for these timestamp certificates, and actually alignment between the power markets and the certificate markets themselves. Because when the certificates are based on the same metering data as is used in the power market, and you have the same time window, you can actually start to use them as a common instrument. And to sort of sketch out some of these ideas, we partnered up with a company in Europe called Nordpool, which is one of the two main power market operators. And we actually have an innovation project to build one of the first or the first spot market for time-stamped energy certificates. And we actually just published last month a white paper on exactly how we see this whole paradigm playing out, which I really recommend reading if you want to dive deeper into it. So we'll share a link to that as well.
So are timestamp certificates, if you do your job well, do you put yourself out of business? Because if we get to green energy and all energy produced becomes somewhat green, I don't need the providence of energy anymore because everything in the grid would be green.
Oh, totally. I love this question. Yeah. So basically, what we're talking about is, getting to a completely decarbonized electric grid and having electrified all of transportation, industry, heating and cooling. And once you do that, you address over 80% of global carbon emissions. Like that is the goal. And the thing that matters most is how quickly we get there, right? Like we need to get there way faster than we're currently moving. And so we need all the tools in the box. And I think unless there is a mechanism for consumers to, play their role and to be able to choose to buy energy, essentially by tagging each unit of electricity on the grid, um, there won't be the sufficient incentives to get there, because it's one thing to get the first 30% of renewables on the grid, but getting the last 30% of renewables on the grid is actually a lot harder because you've got all of the grid integration issues. So I don't think, some countries have targets of 2035. I don't think that's likely. If we do get there, it will only be because we introduce a system like this that allows consumers to play their role, and for policymakers to use such an energy tagging system.
But
Once you get there,
interrupt a couple words you're using here that are catching my attention, right?
yeah.
So I inadvertently said green, which it probably is not right because you are talking about carbon capture and renewable, right?
Yeah,
So those are two different things, right? So
100%.
early on, you said solar and wind. Yep, easy to understand. If I have a gas turbine with the carbon capture capability, do I get a certificate?
Oh yeah. So I'm not sure I mentioned carbon capture. I think I said carbon free. We
Carbon
can
free. Okay.
happily
That's what I'm
talk about.
asking. Is carbon capture count is an acceptable
Yeah,
way to get a certificate?
that's like above my pay grade.
I just curious.
So as a platform, we're agnostic. So right, and many of these targets are based on they're very clear: 24/7 carbon-free energy rather than 24/7 renewable energy. Right,
Okay,
and
so it's about carbon, right? It's about global warming is what the
on
target
it.
is.
That is the primary thing that people are interested in. Yeah. And actually it's governments today who define what technologies can get a certificate and which can't, right? There's a lot of places where nuclear gets certificates. There's actually a few places where everything gets a certificate, right? Thermal gets a certificate, so at least you know whether you're buying coal or not. Right now in a lot of places, you know if you're buying renewable or not, and then if it's not renewable, you just know it's gray, right? It's brown power. But you could actually use it to track every generation, every unit from every generator on the system. That does happen in places like PJM and Austria and a few other places. I mean, I actually think that once you do get to a completely carbon-free grid, like one, the fact that we have a system for tagging all units of energy is actually just going to be a very useful accounting system, right? And people may care of one flavor over another. It may just be a good way to like be able to compensate batteries for helping to balance the system, right? I think we'll find lots of uses for these digital energy tags once we get to a carbon-free grid. But then it's all about helping us to get there quicker, because otherwise we're all screwed.
So, how is this playing out across the world? So, you have emerging markets, you've got developed nations, you got the EU, United States.
Yeah.
Where is this playing strong, and where is this still a long way to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, like, what are the like bottlenecks to evolving these energy certificate systems? So the part of the mission of Energy Tag, which is now run by a great team in Brussels, a guy called Killian Daly is in charge, and this is a non-profit standards body. It's not a technology. It's not offering any kind of service, but it provides a standard so that tracking systems can start to energy certificate tracking systems can add that missing timestamp, so we can get a voluntary market for these certificates going without needing to wait for regulatory change. So obviously there's certain things regulations can do to help drive adoption and to shift the existing certificates, but there aren't really any like regulatory barriers to getting this going from the beginning. And in fact, what we're doing is by showing there's like 500 organizations supporting Energy Tag, and we want to show that this is possible, and that's going to kickstart the regulations. A lot of the renewable energy tracking systems, the people who issue certificates, have already developed the capability to issue time-stamped energy certificates. In the US, the largest tracking system called MRETS is already doing this. PJM is the second largest tracking system. They announced recently that they have the capability to issue time-stamped energy certificates. Similarly in Europe, and actually you'd be surprised in developing markets, their renewable energy certificate systems are very new. And in some cases, they're still being implemented by governments. And so there they actually have the choice to go and implement the old 20-year-old system or just leapfrog and go straight to the new system. And so it's something they're now aware of and looking at very closely. The pain point that we're solving actually is not on the tracking system side, so the people who issue these certificates. We noticed that the utilities, most of them actually, are still using Excel spreadsheets to manage their inventories of energy certificates. And we provide this kind of end-to-end certificate management tool that just makes it easier in their day-to-day jobs of managing these existing certificates, but then also enabling them to give much more transparency to end customers, even down to the hourly level with these new timestamp certificates.
And then, so it sounded like that one of your core customer demographics for your company is utilities. Um, and in probably the early phases, the most effective customer side would be enterprises, right? So a larger to mid-sized
Yeah.
enterprise is going to make the biggest impact. Um, but they have a different mission statement. Maybe they're a producer, maybe they're a bottling plant, maybe they're doing something in their core competence. So how are they choosing to become energy specialists and make sure their energy is green and still focus on their core business?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it depends on the business. Very large businesses, once you consume a certain amount of energy, you get to a point where energy does become need to be a pretty core competency, right? If you're smelting aluminum or aluminium, as we say over here, it's energy is like one of your biggest priorities, right? Like security of supply, because if you have a grid outage, then It's like a $20 million repair bill. And in terms of your overall costs, your variable costs, is like that's the main input. So you'll see some companies like pharmaceuticals as well, and now data center companies as well. They're building energy teams that are really skilled in this, and some of them are even trading. But that's the very minority. The vast majority of businesses, even ones with big energy demand, still rely on their utility, right? They rely on the utility to sell them power, to um, balance their power, right, on the grid for them in all hours. So utilities still play this really important role, privileged role, right, of selling energy to just about everybody, right? Big companies down to individuals, and and their core competency is matching supply and demand on a 24/7 basis. So we think they're also going to be the best placed people to help um, match their customers' energy needs with clean energy, carbon-free energy on a 24/7 basis. But right now they haven't had the right tools to do that. So if this is going to go mass market, it needs to be easy, right? You can't rely on businesses having whole energy teams with power traders. It needs to be really simple, and so utilities need to essentially be able to go to them with a very simple green offer that says, we will manage the complexity, we will deliver you clean energy, but then also be transparent about it, show the customers actually where their energy is coming from, and then the benefits that that are being created when they make that switch, in terms of how they're reducing their carbon emissions, and in terms of the impact on the overall system. So we think utilities have a really important role, and the ones we're working with, like over 20 utilities in 8 countries around the world, and those utilities are really waking up to their responsibility here in the energy transition. And a large part is, it's going to be selfish, right? It's because they've got some customers yelling at them saying, we care about this. We need access to renewable energy. And what, we're going to go move elsewhere if we can't access renewable energy from our local utility.
So you mentioned about 20 companies using this. It's early innings, as I would like to say. So what keeps this from going mainstream? If there was a hurdle that you see ahead of you,
Yeah.
what would keep this from actually developing
Yeah.
the way you describe this?
Yeah. Well, I'm obviously in a bubble, right? But we're hearing a lot of positive noises. We have a growing list of utilities reaching out to us, wanting to offer better products for their customers. Growing list of corporates that are signing up to things like the United Nations has something called the 24/7 carbon-free compact, which is an initiative to get more businesses aware of this issue. So that it's moving in the right directions, but there are a few things that could really tip us over into, or accelerate that the adoption curve. One that I'll highlight is to do with it's something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the accounting standard that the whole world is not specific to the US or Europe or elsewhere, any one country. It's a global standard that sets out how businesses should report on their carbon emissions. And all of these other kind of reporting initiatives that you may have heard of, like the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, or CDP, they all follow what's written in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And that currently, this is called the Scope 2 guidance, that currently allows you to do this old system of annual matching to say, hey, I'm zero carbon in my energy consumption. But that's under review. There's a survey and a review process that's underway. The consultation closed a few weeks ago, and we're expecting kind of the first announcements about it next year, and it'll be finally implemented in not until 2025. So it's going to take some time. But this looks likely to change the current standard. We don't know what to, but certainly, this 24/7 is something that's being looked at very closely. and that would then create a requirement on all businesses to change how they report the carbon emissions associated with their energy consumption, which is becoming, like, as you can imagine, a bigger and bigger piece of the overall carbon emissions. Is like, where is my electricity coming from? Particularly as people electrify their transportation fleets, as they do electrification in other areas, and so that would um, that would be a great help. Let's put it that way. We're tracking about 30 to 40 other regulatory processes, which are all sort of supporting 24/7 and time-stamped energy certificates in some way. But probably, one of the biggest or the most international one is that greenhouse gas protocol.
And then my last question, because we're starting to bump up against time, is who ultimately pays for a service like your service? How does it get paid for?
Yeah, that's great. Well, we're providing a piece of software that benefits utilities because it enables them to improve some of their efficiencies, reduce some of their costs through automation. Um, and it also helps them to um, sell better products, which should some customers are willing to pay, all right, that slight premium, right? They shouldn't be paying more for renewable energy at those times when it's available, but they'll be paying for um, more transparency. They'll be paying for the reports. We help them report the carbon emissions to those customers, and so these can be higher margin products as well. But it's all based on usage. So
That's good.
utilities only pay for it if it's actually being used at the end of the day. But we're a software. We're providing you know a piece of software that has kind of very low cost in relation to the overall value that could potentially come from this transformation in terms of how energy is bought and sold.
All good. I appreciated the explanation. It's been a fun conversation. I've enjoyed hearing a bit about the changes in Rex and the markets that are developing and how you're helping encourage that. Any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Um, so no, I mean, first of all, I really, really appreciate this. It's great. We really are trying to get the word out there about because it's a renewable energy certificates have been this kind of forgotten corner of energy markets, and what we're trying to do is bring them back into the fold and have them play an even more important role than they have been previously by aligning them with how power markets work. And one interesting point to leave you with is that globally there's a lot of discussion about how should we change electricity markets for the better, particularly with the crisis that we saw coming from the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which caused electricity prices to spike, and caused a lot of pain to industry. There's a lot of discussions on the table to reform electricity markets, to make them more resilient, less dependent on natural gas prices, and to help create incentives for things like flexibility. And so this is one of the key themes in that white paper with Nordpool that is highlighted, is these certificates can actually be used to achieve a lot of those stated policy goals when it comes to reforming electricity markets, whether you want to create incentives for local consumption of renewable energy, whether you want to create incentives for carbon-free forms of flexibility as opposed to incentives for gas turbines, right, which currently benefit financially exactly the same in today's markets. So we just want to put this on the radar of policymakers and decision makers for this. This is a new instrument that's coming, and use it to your advantage.
Well, Toby, thank you so much for being a guest on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. We've talked a bit about Rex over the past couple of years. They can be contentious. You can see they can also be used for a catalyst for change. We hope you've enjoyed this content. If you had, don't forget to subscribe, follow us, and share us with your friends. We'll talk to you again next time on Insider's Guide to Energy. Bye-bye.